The novel coronavirus is now a global pandemic. The outbreak that started in late 2019 with a few dozen cases showing up in central China's Hubei province has since grown to infect more than 200,000 people across 54 countries, with global deaths now confirmed to have exceeded 10,000. Stocks are experiencing their biggest point drop since the crash of 1929. International travel is restricted, and countries around the world are forced quarantining their population to stop the spread, with similar measures starting to appear in cities across the U.S.
We've made the decision to further toughen the guidelines and blunt the infection now.
I think the government response in the United States has been catastrophic, actually. It's caused a run on the stores, and it's caused a general nationwide paranoia and really full panic.
But public panic hasn't stopped private initiative, which has proven to be quite effective in times of crisis, perhaps even more so than governments.
Quarantines, deploying the military, that's been the reaction of China, Italy, and the United States, whereas we've seen a very different approach from South Korea.
Different countries are handling the outbreak in different ways. Millions are locked down in Italy. In South Korea, only a few thousand.
South Korea preserved the open society, and now infection rates are falling. So we hear all these governors talking about potential curfews and lockdowns and everything else. The approach of a country like South Korea, the exact opposite of that, and it worked for them.
In these times, it's really important to remember what is the basis of society? Where does our prosperity come from? Where are we getting the essential goods and services that we need to survive, even in the face of such a shocking thing like a pandemic disease?
Asian financial markets have been thrown into turmoil, with oil prices falling to their lowest in 4 years. Investors also opting for safety due to continuing fears that the COVID-19 outbreak will send the global economy into recession.
No, it's really hurting the average person, especially small business. Right. I think that there's the health risk, but there's the economic risk by making restaurant workers unemployed and all these small businesses having to stay at home for weeks, maybe even months. This is going to be a huge burden on them.
The fallout from COVID-19 seems like something out of a comic book. Without warning, thousands of businesses have been forced to close their doors to the public. Billions of dollars has been wiped off the stock market, and forecasts have escalated from postponing Coachella to echoes of the Great Depression. The Trump administration has already signed multiple stimulus packages to provide relief to area hospitals and affected workers, including talks of giving a $1,000 check to American adults and $500 checks to children. People want to freeze rents, corporations are lobbying for bailouts, and the Federal Reserve has restarted its quantitative easing program to increase the domestic money supply, hoping to rally or at least bring some momentary calm to Wall Street. But investors aren't taking the bait. Between extended public safety concerns and supply chain disruptions, many people who just last Christmas were enjoying record high earnings on investment are now watching their retirement portfolios and 401ks plummet every opening bell.
So people who are closer to retirement, the upper half, say, of the baby boomers, I would imagine that they are concerned, especially because their retirement accounts, their IRAs and 401ks and all that took a really big hit about 10 years ago. And here they are again. We have, with a I guess by this time it's almost 15 to 20% drop in financial markets, in U.S. equities specifically. So I think there probably will be a lot of nervousness on the part of people who are within a few years of retirement.
America is still in the early stages of managing the crisis. We've started seeing some of the implications interfere in our daily lives. Kids home from school, the office shut down, but all in all, not that much has changed on the ground. Most of the anxiety is on what may happen in the coming months. As we've already seen in places like Wuhan and northern Italy, it has the potential to gridlock entire economic regions. These NASA images showing carbon emissions before and after government-enforced lockdown mitigation tactics gives you some idea of how impactful long-term quarantines can be. But even more of a concern may be the short-term stability of what is quintessentially the world's factory.
I think that how the Chinese government handles the coronavirus is of importance to a lot of Americans because we already have tariffs. We already had sort of a trade war with them. And if they were to say either clamp down further or even say to mislead the U.S. and the rest of the world about the status of their corralling of the coronavirus, it introduces more uncertainty and it could further hinder earnings, and that would send the prices of equities and other financial instruments lower. So the reaction is completely to be anticipated with each new bit of information comes out, which is not only information about how states are reacting, but about new research and the infection rate and the various effectiveness different nations are having in their measures to control the coronavirus. There's a new assessment of exactly how corporate earnings will be affected.
After initial containment efforts failed in mainland China, the Communist Party's response was nothing short of bold. Mobilizing citywide sanitation teams, forcibly quarantining 46 million Chinese citizens, and other totalitarian impositions on commerce and movement. But no one's really been keeping track of the Communist Party's humanitarian record during this pandemic. Some critics have taken to social media under the hashtag China lied, people died, arguing that much of this could have been avoided had CCP leadership not suppressed early warnings and information about the severity of the disease and tried to censor its existence from the world. Soon after, a counter hashtag emerged, titled Trump lied, people died. After all, the president himself hasn't been very forthcoming on this either, offering little in the way of a serious address and defaulting to his usual strategy of trolling media and critics on Twitter.
Members of Congress are now being tested positive for coronavirus, and you have almost 24 who are self-quarantining. Do you have any guidance for Congress? Should they?
I know all of them, and I don't know if they're sitting like you people are sitting. You're actually sitting too close. We should probably get rid of about another 75, 80% of you. I'll have just 2 or 3 that I like in this room. I think that's a great way of doing it. We just figured a new way of doing it, but you're actually much too close. You two, you should leave immediately.
The government response in the United States has been catastrophic. Apparently the CDC, a month before the panic hit the U.S., had already done some modeling and had best and worst case scenarios, and the data looked extremely grim. But instead of acting on it and doing things like permitting private labs to develop new tests or encouraging private researchers to look for cures and vaccines and things, they just froze into inaction and fear, for fear that releasing this information would cause public panic and that sort of thing. Eventually, of course, the panic came along. Once the draconian action started, where mayors were declaring states of emergency and shutting down conferences, but people were completely unprepared for this. Why is this happening? And it's caused a run on the stores and really full panic. Even though some people today are recommending panic, I have a feeling that panicking is probably not the best thing. Rational response is the best thing. The best way to make a rational response is with good information. And that we have not been getting.
Without sound and conclusive information, speculation and worst-case scenarios fill our heads, and we freak out over what usually amounts to an obscure data point to sell a clickbait headline. And now states and politicians are banning assembly and commerce on the grounds of these incomplete predictive models. An annoying reality, but one it seems we have no choice but to accept. Because so long as fear and uncertainty is fueling the national conversation, power-hungry reactionaries will do whatever they want and go largely unscrutinized, so long as it brings us peace of mind, including violating contracts, prohibiting travel, placing people under effective house arrest, and breeding an ever greater appreciation of modern draconianism. Or in other words, the preferred strategy of the first central authority to respond to COVID-19, i.e., the Chinese Communist Party.
The response of China has been what I would call the classic response to a health crisis, to a pandemic or epidemic, which is to say they respond with force, quarantines, deploying the military, all that sort of thing. That's been the reaction of China, Italy, and the United States, whereas we've seen a very different approach from South Korea, where they've sort of embraced technology and an open and transparent society, the values of those societies, in fighting the coronavirus in different ways.
Even with the relatively high numbers of confirmed cases in South Korea, people in the country are staying calm and supermarket shelves remain well stocked.
Hyper-aggressive authoritarianism isn't the only winning approach to battling the coronavirus. South Korea at one point appeared as though it would topple Italy in terms of coronavirus affliction, but the country has actually had one of the most successful mitigation campaigns in the world thus far, without deploying military, forcing communities into lockdown, or even pressuring firms and small vendors to shutter operations. This sprawling country of 51.4 million residents has trounced Italy and the US in controlling the outbreak. In his article for AIER, Earle highlighted how Korea's public-private partnership led to one of the fastest and voluntary recoveries on record. They successfully scaled one of the first drive-through testing facilities. They enlisted the expertise of entrepreneurs and property owners to develop voluntary open-source health registries and self-quarantine apps, which proved to be a very practical approach thanks to the country's huge technology market. All this, while minimally disrupting normal economic and societal functions. South Korea's vice health minister summarized the underlying premise of the government's approach to arresting the spread of the coronavirus. Quote, "Without harming the principle of a transparent and open society, we recommend a response system that blends voluntary public participation with creative applications of advanced technology." Health officials even slash regulations that can keep vital medical innovations in legal limbo for years. A week after holding their first coronavirus task force meeting, Korea's CDC approved one company's diagnostic test. A few days later, another company followed, and by the end of February, Korea was making headlines around the world for its drive-through screening centers and ability to test thousands of people daily thanks to a rapid supply of test kits from the private sector. There has been some criticism against Korea's use of intrusive surveillance systems like facial recognition, which they use to track and quarantine some suspected cases. But in full context, vastly more respectful of the individual citizen and private industry than anyone else we've seen under similar conditions.
They've used a lot of voluntary services. Like I said, they leverage technology. They've deputized owners of private property to require, if they want, that people wear masks to enter and that sort of thing. And as I commented in an article which will be out tomorrow, I can just imagine what Americans, or how many Americans would react if they were told they couldn't enter their favorite restaurant or whatever without a mask.
The idea of allowing private business owners to enforce discriminatory no mask, no entry policies seems like a very common sense approach. But Pete's right. Americans would probably prefer everyone be equally barred from public gatherings than allow businesses to effectively find ways to mitigate spread through their own volition. Most small businesses are already taking basic precautions like giving employees protective medical gear and increasing sanitation capacity, or restaurant owners limiting their fill capacity to allow greater social distancing for patrons. All in line with the CDC's recommendation for private citizens, yet somehow insufficient for businesses. America doesn't even have an ample supply of test kits available yet. Without accurate data on the rate of infection, it's hard to say whether some of these mitigation efforts are working or even warranted. But the risk of families having their entire businesses shut down for weeks by state and local authorities is very real and very scary, and threatens the income of millions of American workers.
I'm much more in favor of private decisions to do those sorts of things than of impositions by, say, government decree, which tend to fall like a sort of a blanket with no nuance.
Bans on public gatherings isn't the only disruption facing our economy. There's also a general economic misunderstanding that suggests profiting from or during a disaster is an immoral act. For example, in Tennessee, a man stockpiled over 17,000 bottles of hand sanitizer before panic buying ensued, intending to resell them at a higher cost. But once Amazon deleted his listings and local authorities picked up on the story, his inventory was seized and redistributed.
And new this morning, a Hamilton County man who bought 18,000 bottles of hand sanitizer and racked up prices online is now under investigation by the state attorney general in Tennessee. The AG sent Matt Colvin and his brother Noah a cease and desist order.
Many people on social media cheered the bust and even argued that he faced legal penalty for his price gouging attempt.
Price gouging is a term of vilification that describes raising prices on goods when they're in short supply, when there's high demand, raising prices. So something leaves the shelves or it's hard to find, like hand sanitizer, like gasoline in the period just after Hurricane Sandy hit. People start appearing on message boards or making deals to sell goods at sometimes multiples of what their actual price had been in stores and such.
Amazon's not the only company to start imposing consumer protections against aspiring coronavirus capitalists. Facebook recently decided to ban advertisements for medical masks, including all private commercial listings on its sister platform, Facebook Marketplace. In an official statement, Facebook said, quote, "Our teams are monitoring the COVID-19 situation closely, and we will make necessary updates to our policies if we see people trying to exploit this public health emergency." eBay has also joined in enforcing restrictions on selling face masks, hand sanitizer, and toilet paper, citing similar concerns of exploitative sellers. Crackdowns on price gouging is obviously the popular strategy, but is it the proper strategy?
You know, I think it's extremely important that private enterprise profit from this disaster, actually, because if you're not profiting from something, then you're losing from something. And if you're profiting from it, you can continue to do it. And that's why we need prices for scarce goods to rise rather than fall or be frozen, because if they're frozen, they're just going to disappear from the markets. And if you think about it, and you should, think about where you're getting your groceries, where you're getting your Earle. You know, where does the hospital get its testing equipment? Who's going to invent the cure? You know, where are we getting the essential supplies? How are we safe? Where are we going to quarantine ourselves? Every single bit of the material goods and services that we're getting to survive this and make rational decisions has come from us through the market, through freedom, through contracts and individual volition, not through some central planning.
Price gouging is something that should perhaps be encouraged, although, like I said, that's a term of a program. That's a negative term. When goods fly off shelves or disappear from stores, what tends to happen is people want to offer them for higher prices. And the price mechanism induces producers to either start to produce goods which are in short supply so they can capture those higher prices and therefore higher profit margins, or to direct their production from areas which have smaller profit margins to others. So prices should be allowed to fluctuate, and when more goods flow to an area where there's a shortage, those prices will tend to fall. That's exactly what happened with gasoline in the period after Hurricane Sandy.
I can't help but reiterate how unreal all this feels. We're told constantly to think about how this disease threatens life as we know it. But is it necessary that we sacrifice the things that keep life going? It's unknown whether the strategy of government containment versus private mitigation will determine our future for the foreseeable seasons. But fears will almost certainly continue to swell under either condition as the media continues to rally hysteria and incite market panic. As we try our best to navigate this sudden reality, it's important to maintain a clear and rational perspective, not only in terms of what we believe is best for ourselves, but also what we know to be true, which for many of us is our faith, partnership, and principles, none of which originate from the White House podium or chambers of City Hall. Jeffrey Tucker maintains a similar belief that the draconian responses to COVID-19, along with the societal response of morally shaming people simply for trying to keep their households financially solvent, hasn't done Americans any good in getting ahead of this virus.
You know, here's my essential message about all this stuff. The pandemic is shocking. The worst case scenarios are essentially unthinkable, but nothing about any of the news we're getting today changes anything about the fundamentals of economics and social organization. Freedom is essential. Individual decision-making, rationality, relying on communities to organize themselves and for families to take care of themselves is the only way forward. If we're going to throw all of our energies and trust into central government, take the worst possible decisions. Already we've seen the government fail by withholding information, by curbing information flows, by lying to us and diverting us and using the crisis for political agendas, whether it's on the left or the right. This stuff is a disaster, and it's wearing thin, and people don't believe it anymore. What people need right now is good information so they can make rational decisions in their own self-interest to protect their communities. And that requires fundamentally a social structure of freedom and openness and the ability for us to be able to take care of ourselves without being bullied and muscled and quarantined and pushed around by a central state that we know is only interested in its own survival, not ours.